Probabilism means things that are likely to be true, or there's a certain percentage. I've said this over and over again. Science is about probability, and that's it. Do we live in a probabilistic universe? Do we live in a world where things are likely to be true, but there is no guarantee? Because that's the question. What is the percentage chance of something being true? So science is that thing which defines probability. It basically has as its outcomes a percentage chance of something being true. And philosophy is something different. And so my argument has always been science has taken over philosophy. And Russell's point in the early part of the 20th century was that we are switching from a deterministic to a probabilistic universe. I get that latter part of his statement. I do think we live in a world where all we have is the percentages, a certain percentage of something being true, rather than an infallible, definite way of looking at it. We're going to talk about science, religion, and philosophy. All three ways of knowing related to probabilism, which is the idea that there's a percentage chance of things being true. And in response to Russell's claim, the first part is science, which is the business of probability. And I've said this over and over again when scientists claim this particular aspect of science proves something 100% or proves something to be true. What you're really saying is there's a percentage chance. And that's really all David Hume was saying. That's what the empiricists were getting at, is that we can't lay claim to some absolute certainty. And so certainty went away, and that's why Nietzsche responded in the 19th century saying we now live in a world without value. That would have an effect on culture and the way people overall think. And that's really my claim, is Nietzsche's claim, even though people argue with the particulars. And so the second thing that we're talking about is religion, and that is how religion has responded to this shift. It is a shift between absolute certainty, probability, and now a multitude of definitions. And looking at the seminarians and looking at religious philosophy, what you find is just this. You find this myriad, whatever that word means, of new definitions for what it means to deal with probability, certainty, things like that. Within morality, so within morality, religion was worried about whether things were absolutely certain or what effects that certainty had on putting those moral ideas, and in that case, moral certainty, into action, which means what happened. And they knew the history wasn't good. And so they were allowing in what's called probabilism. But what happened was the seminarians started to disagree. They started to shift. There was debates. So when I looked into religious debates, I found things like rigorism, which is this leaning more towards certainty, laxism, which is leaning more toward less certainty, tutorialism, I have no idea what that means, probabilism, which we're discussing. But one of the most dominant was called, I really have to look at this one, probabilior. I didn't even make that one up. Usually I make fun of myself with big words. I didn't make it up that time. And probabiliorism was a reaction against the probability theory. And all of this has to do with how you treat moral law when you can't be absolutely certain. And so the church was saying you can be certain about some things and you can be completely uncertain, and everyone disagrees about other things. But in the middle, you have a lot of stuff. What do you do with that? And a lot of it was how you gain the opinion. So how you get the probability, and on what do you rely for that probability? And a lot of it was that this particular member of the church who's held in high esteem is able to think about and express the problem in such a way that he comes away with the safest probability, or a certain number of these religious thinkers together agree on a certain priority and we can accept it. So these debates went back and forth throughout the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, and they're probably still going on today from what I know about church philosophy. But it is a really interesting take on what's happened. And so that's why we're going to end with the philosophy. We did science and religion. And now we're talking about philosophy in terms of probabilism. And the reason we are is because my particular take, maybe Kant's take, definitely Nietzsche's take, was that when the shift happened in the 17th century, the visible, real shift from the empiricists, what you have is more of an open field for the probabilistic theories, which means we now are critiquing absolute certainty across the board. So, and it's basically religious history. And it's not just religion, because communism did the same thing. But, and of course that was much later. But what you have in the 18th century is this critique of the negative consequences of absolute certainty held by people, which means they all got on one side of an issue. That issue was inflexible, and then it became an element of law in some sense, and then that had negative consequences for all the people that didn't believe, or all the people that even looked like they didn't believe. And so this was a reaction against that, and probabilism is what Russell's talking about, is this thing where the most truth we can have is a percentage chance. Science has shown us that, and that's where we're moving. So I'm going to read some of these quotes. We're going to talk about them really quick, and then we'll end the video. One of the quotes is, "A process of self-definition in the face of uncertainty." And so this is how we are supposed to see the philosophical mindset post 18th century empiricism. What we're seeing is that now, in the face of uncertainty, we have to redefine epistemology. Another quote is, and this was an interesting element of the evolution of probabilism, but the macro accumulation of quantum elements makes complexity seem determined. So this was a lot about the philosophical argument for and against free will. And it was that when you have quantum particles, and this is more recent, but when you have quantum particles in physics, those seem to be behaving randomly, and there's a percentage chance they're going to do certain things. And so at that level, you fail to see a determinist universe, even though those are the people claiming the universe is determined. But I'm assuming some of them aren't, and I don't know a lot of them, and I'm not a scientist. But what their point was similar to what you made in the 18th century about philosophy, and this is more about science, even though it comes philosophical, and it is that when these quantum particles accumulate and become complex objects, any object you can think of that is going to be a complex object relative to a quantum particle, that probabilistic universe glued together appears to seem determined. And it does because of the complex movements of the particles, which themselves are more probabilistic. And I think this is what Russell meant, who was dramatically influenced by science over philosophy. So that's where we're going with the probabilistic theory. That's where we use it in terms of starting to understand epistemology, whatever that big word means, and trying to put it into action in terms of how, at least for me, we shift culturally to start to accept a worldview where we have science doing a percentage chance and philosophy exploring the idea that that's not the only thing. And I think that's a good place to end.